What if Monkey D. Dragon stayed a Marine? If you ask any One Piece fan to name the most mysterious figure in the story, chances are many will say Monkey D. Dragon. He is the leader of the Revolutionary Army, the man who actively wages war against the world government and the father of Monkey D. Luffy. Yet, despite his importance, Oda has revealed very little about his past, his abilities, or even his true motivations. What we do know is that Dragon was once part of the Marines, the same institution where his father, Garp, became a legendary hero. At some point, Dragon decided to turn his back on the Marines, turn his back on the world government, and create a global movement dedicated to tearing down the very system he had once sworn to uphold. That decision is the fulcrum upon which history turned. But what if that choice never happened? What if Monkey D. Dragon had remained in the Marines, climbing the ranks, shaping their future, and confronting the contradictions of the system from within? That is the question we will explore in this what-if scenario. To begin, let us set the stage by revisiting the world in which Dragon was born and raised. He was the son of Monkey D. Garp, the hero of the Marines, a man whose strength rivaled even the Pirate King, Goldie Roger. Garp was famous not only for his physical might, but also for his strong moral compass, a complicated sense of justice that refused promotions and titles, choosing freedom over authority. This environment surely influenced Dragon. Unlike most Marines, Dragon did not grow up worshipping the world government or revering the celestial dragons. He grew up watching his father constantly resist being pulled into the inner circles of power. Garp could have become an admiral, but chose not to, because he despised the politics of the world government. So, Dragon inherited not only his father's strength, but also his father's rebellious spirit. In the official story, this rebelliousness eventually led him to abandon the Marines entirely. But in our scenario, he doesn't. Instead, Dragon decides to remain within the system, perhaps believing that he can change it from the inside. And this choice would have massive consequences, not only for the Marines themselves, but for the entire balance of power across the world. Imagine a man with Dragon's charisma, ideology, and willpower positioned at the top of the Marine hierarchy. It is a completely different picture from the world we know. The Marines, after all, are not a monolith. Within their ranks, there are factions, philosophies, and personal interpretations of justice. We see this most clearly in the contrast between Akainu's absolute justice, Aokiji's lazy justice, and Fujitora's humane justice. Now imagine Dragon inserting his own philosophy into this mix. What kind of justice would Dragon embody if he had remained a Marine? He despises tyranny and oppression, so it would be something closer to what Fujitora represents, but much sharper, more radical. His justice would not simply be about fighting pirates. It would be about dismantling systems of abuse and restructuring society in ways that benefit ordinary people. In other words, Dragon would be a reformist Marine, someone determined to reshape the institution into a force for true justice, not merely a shield for the world government. But before we can leap too far into speculation, let's take a moment to consider why Dragon left in the first place. Oda has not revealed the full details, but we can infer from the timeline and his actions that Dragon became disillusioned with the world government's cruelty. Incidents like the O'Hara massacre, where innocent scholars were annihilated for researching history, would have disgusted someone like him. The treatment of ordinary citizens by the celestial dragons, who are allowed to enslave, kill, and abuse people with no consequences, would have been unbearable for him to watch as a Marine. So the split was inevitable. But in our alternate timeline, we must imagine that Dragon decided to endure the corruption, at least long enough to climb higher in the ranks. This would make him a dangerous figure within the system itself. As a vice admiral, or later as an admiral, Dragon would command fleets, oversee major battles, and gain the trust of soldiers who admired his leadership. his charisma, which canonically allowed him to rally people into forming the Revolutionary Army, would instead consolidate power within the Marines. Soldiers disillusioned with the cruelty of Akainu's absolute justice or the apathy of others would find hope in Dragon's vision. Over time, he could cultivate a faction of Marines loyal to his ideals. But what about the world government? The Gorosei, the Five Elders, are not naive. They would see Dragon's growing influence, and they would recognize the danger he poses. A Marine who is too idealistic, too compassionate, and too willing to challenge their authority would become a liability. The Gorosei tolerate men like Garp because Garp refuses promotions and therefore never threatens their direct control. They tolerate Sengoku because he is pragmatic and obedient when needed. But Dragon would not play that game. If he rose too high, the Gorosei would attempt to control him, or if that failed, to eliminate him. So one of the key tensions in this what-if scenario is whether Dragon could actually survive within the system without being purged by those above him. Now, let's zoom out and consider the broader world. In canon, Dragon creates the Revolutionary Army, which becomes the only real global opposition to the world government. Pirates, no matter how powerful, do not threaten the system itself. They are outlaws, and while they disrupt trade and challenge marine fleets, they don't have the political vision or organizational structure to topple the world order. Only Dragon provides that. His revolutionary army liberates kingdoms, recruits allies, and spreads the idea that the world government is not invincible. Remove Dragon from that role, and the entire world changes. There is no revolutionary army. The Sorbet Kingdom, where Kuma lived, may never be liberated. Ivankov and the Okama from Kamabaka Kingdom may never join a larger cause. Sabo may never find his true path as a revolutionary. In other words, the world loses its greatest organized resistance against tyranny. So the stakes are enormous. On one hand, the Marines gain a brilliant and morally driven leader. On the other hand, the people of the world lose their most important revolutionary force. It is a trade-off with massive implications. Would Dragon accomplish more inside the Marines or outside? That is the heart of our question. To explore this fully, we must carefully reconstruct a timeline. When Dragon stays in the Marines, he begins to rise through the ranks during the era of Roger's execution and the dawn of the Great Pirate Era. This is crucial. The Marines are scrambling to maintain order as the seas become flooded with pirates inspired by Roger's last words. In this chaos, a Marine like Dragon would stand out. His ability to rally troops, strategize, and offer hope would make him indispensable. The leadership of the Marines, Sengoku, Tsuru, even Garp, would recognize his value. Unlike Garp, Dragon would not refuse promotions. He would climb. By the time Luffy is born, Dragon could already be an admiral, or on the verge of becoming one. Now think about how this would affect Luffy's life. In canon, Luffy grows up in East Blue under the care of Garp and Dadan, with Dragon largely absent. But if Dragon were a Marine admiral, his presence in Luffy's childhood would be more significant. Perhaps he would still be distant, occupied with duties, but his influence would loom larger. Luffy might have grown up hearing tales of his father's heroics, of how Dragon fought for justice on behalf of the people. That might have pulled Luffy toward the Marines, or at least created a stronger internal conflict when he chose piracy. Without the image of Dragon as the world's most wanted man, Luffy would see him as a respected figure of authority. Would he still want to be Pirate King? Maybe. But the decision would carry a different emotional weight. Instead of rebelling against his father's absence and against the world government, he would be rebelling against his father's legacy of justice. That alone would create a fascinating dynamic. And let's not forget Ace and Sabo. In canon, Sabo becomes Dragon's adopted son within the Revolutionary Army. But in this timeline, there is no Revolutionary Army for him to join. Sabo's story might end with his death at the hands of the celestial dragon in Goa, or perhaps he is saved by Dragon the Marine rather than Dragon the Revolutionary. Imagine Dragon arriving to stop the celestial dragon's cruelty, not as an outlaw, but as an admiral. That would profoundly alter Sabo's trajectory. Ace, meanwhile, would still be Goldie Roger's son, hidden and raised in secrecy. But if Dragon were a Marine, would he still intervene at Marineford in the same way? Or would his loyalties be divided between his duty as a Marine and his responsibility as a father to protect Luffy's sworn brother? The further we dive, the more we see how interconnected this choice really is. Dragon's decision to stay or leave does not only affect him, it affects the Marines, the world government, the pirates, the revolutionaries, and even the future of the Straw Hats themselves. It ripples outward into every major conflict of the One Piece world. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's return to the immediate question. What would Dragon's role in the Marines actually look like? He is not like Akainu, who thrives in enforcing absolute obedience. He is not like Kizaru, who floats lazily above moral questions. And he is not like Aokiji, who embodies a reluctant sense of duty. Dragon would be proactive. He would push for change. He would demand accountability from corrupt officials. He would fight for ordinary citizens. This makes him both the best and the worst person to have inside the system. Best, because he could inspire real reforms. Worst, because his very presence would destabilize the fragile balance the world government maintains. And that is where the tension lies. Could Dragon have actually succeeded as a Marine? Or would he have been assassinated or exiled before he reached his peak? If the Gorosei feared him enough, they would not hesitate to eliminate him, even if it meant sparking chaos in the Marines. But Dragon is not easily silenced. His will is unbreakable. So perhaps, in this alternate world, we would see a power struggle unlike anything in canon. Not between the Marines and the revolutionaries, but between different factions inside the Marines themselves. Dragon's faction, fighting for justice with integrity, against Akainu's faction, fighting for justice through fear and violence. That battle could redefine the meaning of the Marines entirely. As we step deeper into this hypothetical timeline, remember that the core of this question is not simply, what if Dragon stayed in the Marines? It is also, what is the true nature of justice in One Piece? The story constantly pushes us to think about what justice really means, whether it is the rigid, merciless justice of Akainu, the lazy justice of Aokiji, or the compassionate justice of Fujitora. Dragon's justice, if he had remained, might have been the most revolutionary form of all, a justice that actively defies tyranny, even while wearing the Marine uniform. And that idea, more than anything else, shows us why his departure mattered so much. In the chapters to come, we will explore the implications of this choice across every corner of the One Piece world, from the fate of the Revolutionary Army, to the rise of Luffy, to the great wars that shape history. We will reimagine how everything might unfold if Dragon had chosen the uniform over rebellion. This is not just a story of one man's career. It is a story of how one decision can alter the balance of an entire world. To understand what Dragon would have become had he stayed within the Marines, we need to start with the foundations of his life. Dragon was not just any recruit. He was born into the monkey family, the son of the legendary Garp. Growing up in that shadow would have meant living under the weight of extraordinary expectations. From a very young age, Dragon would have been familiar with the discipline, physical training, and values of the Marine institution. Garp may have been a rebel in his own way, refusing promotions and mocking the celestial dragons, but he remained a Marine to his core, and that world was Dragon's childhood environment. In this alternate path, Dragon does not reject his father's chosen institution. Instead, he embraces it, believing that it is his responsibility to continue the family legacy and bring about change from within. As a child, Dragon would have been immersed in stories of pirates and justice. Garp likely spoke often of Roger, of Shiki, of Whitebeard, of the chaotic seas filled with pirates who threatened the lives of civilians. But Garp's lessons were never simplistic. He did not preach blind loyalty to the world government. He probably warned Dragon that the Marines were flawed, that the celestial dragons were corrupt, and that a Marine's duty was not to serve the rulers, but to protect the people. These lessons would have planted the seeds of Dragon's later ideology. Unlike other recruits who were indoctrinated to see the world government as sacred, Dragon grew up with a more complicated view. He knew from the beginning that justice was not absolute. When Dragon formally joined the Marines, his career would have taken off quickly. With Garp as a father, doors would open. But more importantly, Dragon had the raw talent, strength, and intelligence to back it up. He would excel in physical training, likely mastering advanced martial arts, and perhaps beginning to awaken a devil fruit ability, if he ever obtained one during his service. He would also demonstrate strong leadership qualities. Unlike many officers who inspire fear through cruelty, Dragon would inspire respect through charisma and fairness. His subordinates would follow him willingly, trusting that he cared for their well-being. In these early years, Dragon's missions would involve the usual tasks of the Marines: hunting down pirates, protecting merchant ships, and enforcing order in unstable regions. But already, his approach would stand out. Where other Marines might dismiss civilian suffering as collateral damage, Dragon would focus on minimizing harm to ordinary people. Where others would follow orders without question, Dragon would ask why those orders were given. This would earn him both admiration and suspicion. Admirers would see him as a beacon of true justice, someone who gave them pride in wearing the Marine uniform. Suspicious superiors, however, would view him as insubordinate, too idealistic, and perhaps even dangerous in the long run. One of the key questions is how Dragon would have interacted with the Marines' hierarchy. Imagine him serving under Sengoku, Tsuru, or even Zephyr. Sengoku would likely appreciate Dragon's intelligence, but worry about his lack of obedience to authority. Tsuru, with her sharp mind and sense of morality, might have found common ground with him. Zephyr, who trained generations of Marines, might have seen Dragon as one of his most promising students. At this stage, Dragon would still believe in the possibility of reform, still think he could work through the chain of command to improve the institution. The world had not yet pushed him to the brink. But history has a way of testing ideals. As Dragon advanced in rank, he would begin to see more of the world government's darker side. Missions to suppress uprisings in kingdoms might reveal that the rebels were simply starving citizens fighting corrupt monarchs backed by the celestial dragons. Orders to enforce slavery laws or ignore the abuse of nobles would grind against his conscience. Each time Dragon confronted these realities, he would face a choice: obey orders or follow his own sense of justice. In our scenario, he chooses to obey enough to remain within the system, but his disillusionment grows. We can imagine a pivotal early mission that shaped him. Perhaps Dragon was sent to a kingdom where the nobility had enslaved a portion of its population. The world government's interest was in maintaining stability and protecting the nobility's wealth, not liberating the people. Dragon would lead his troops to restore order, but witnessing the suffering firsthand would harden his resolve. Instead of simply crushing the rebellion, he might secretly work to mitigate the nobles' cruelty, perhaps even freeing some of the oppressed in ways that went unrecorded. This would build his reputation among soldiers as someone who cared about civilians, but it would also put him on the radar of higher authorities. To the Gorosei, a Marine officer who undermines noble authority is not an asset, but a threat. As he rose to the rank of Vice Admiral, Dragon's influence would expand. Vice Admirals are trusted with buster calls, with immense power over life and death. Imagine Dragon at the helm of a Buster Call, where another officer might unleash total destruction without hesitation. Dragon would resist, question, and perhaps even refuse. His refusal might earn him reprimands, but his results on the battlefield would protect him from outright dismissal. In a sense, he would become a tolerated anomaly, too useful to discard, but too dangerous to fully trust. The relationships Dragon formed with other Marines would also matter. With Aokiji, for instance, Dragon might have found a kindred spirit. Kuzan's lazy justice masks a deep sense of morality, and he too has moments of compassion that set him apart from Akainu's brutality. Together, Dragon and Kuzan could form an informal alliance within the Marines, a faction dedicated to protecting people rather than blindly following orders. Fujitora, though he appears much later, would have been another natural ally, though their careers may not have overlapped directly in this timeline. Against them, however, would stand Akainu. Sakazuki embodies the complete opposite philosophy, absolute justice at any cost. To him, Dragon's compassion would look like weakness, a betrayal of Marine duty. The clash between these two ideologies would simmer beneath the surface, setting the stage for inevitable conflict. Dragon's potential as an admiral is one of the most fascinating aspects of this scenario. Admirals are the highest combat authorities beneath the Fleet Admiral, symbols of marine power. If Dragon reached this rank, his philosophy would become far harder to ignore. Every battle he fought, every order he gave, every decision he made would ripple across the seas. Pirates would begin to fear not only his strength, but also his unpredictability. Was he a Marine who would slaughter without mercy, like Akainu? Or was he one who might spare civilians, even sympathize with their plight? Such ambiguity could make him even more dangerous, because no one could predict how he would act. But would the world government ever allow him to rise so high? This is where the contradictions intensify. The Gorosei, and perhaps even Imu, would monitor Dragon closely. They would see his growing popularity among the lower ranks, his radical ideas about justice, and his unwillingness to bow completely to their authority. At some point, they would consider whether to sabotage his career. Perhaps they would assign him to missions designed to tarnish his reputation. Perhaps they would spread rumors of disobedience. Or perhaps they would try to eliminate him through subtle assassination. But Dragon is not easy to remove. His strength and his allies would protect him. It is also possible that Dragon might leverage his heritage as Garp's son to shield himself. Garp himself was tolerated for decades, despite refusing promotions and mocking the celestial dragons. Why? Because he was indispensable, the man who cornered Roger, the man who defended Marineford against the strongest pirates. Dragon, as his son, might inherit some of that protection, at least for a time. As long as he delivered results, the world government might grit its teeth and endure his presence. Meanwhile, the ordinary soldiers of the Marines would rally around him. For every officer who blindly followed orders, there were countless grunts who suffered, who wondered why they were forced to protect the privileges of nobles instead of defending common people. To them, Dragon would represent hope. He would embody the ideal of true justice, not the twisted justice of politics. Slowly, a faction would form. They would not call themselves revolutionaries, because they were still Marines. But in their hearts, they would be loyal to Dragon, not to the world government. This hidden faction would be one of the most dangerous forces inside the institution, because it could grow silently until it rivaled the official chain of command. At this point, we must pause and ask, what exactly would Dragon's justice look like? It is not absolute justice, because he does not believe in killing civilians for the sake of order. It is not lazy justice, because he is proactive. It is not even complete humane justice, because Dragon is willing to fight and kill when necessary. The closest label might be revolutionary justice. This form of justice does not simply punish wrongdoers, but seeks to transform society itself. Within the Marines, Dragon would constantly push boundaries, seeking to change not just how battles are fought, but why they are fought. That is revolutionary thinking within a rigid hierarchy. Imagine the dilemmas this would create. When ordered to protect a celestial dragon, Dragon might do so, but quietly prevent the noble from abusing civilians. When ordered to suppress a rebellion, he might negotiate with rebels instead of slaughtering them. When asked to enforce laws that enslaved people, he might bend those laws or create loopholes. These actions would erode the world government's authority while simultaneously strengthening his image among the common people. Over time, citizens might come to see Dragon as the only trustworthy Marine, a man who truly serves them rather than the celestial dragons. This is dangerous because the legitimacy of the world government depends on the illusion that Marines are united in serving their interests. Dragon's presence would crack that illusion. Another layer to consider is Dragon's personal life. In canon, Dragon is an absent father, leaving Luffy to be raised by Garp. But if Dragon were a Marine, would he have been more involved? Perhaps not much. Marine duty is demanding, and high-ranking officers often have little time for family. But the difference is in perception. Luffy would grow up not as the son of the world's most wanted man, but as the son of a Marine hero. That changes his identity. Luffy might still dream of becoming Pirate King, but he would carry the knowledge that his father stands on the opposite side of the law. This could create a powerful tension when they eventually meet. Instead of father and son reunited as rebel and pirate, it would be father and son confronting each other as Marine and outlaw. The same goes for Sabo. In canon, Sabo is saved by Dragon and becomes his protege. In this timeline, perhaps Dragon is still the one who saves him, but as a Marine, he might prevent Sabo's death at the hands of a celestial dragon, then raise him quietly, training him as a Marine instead of a revolutionary. Sabo could grow into the high-ranking officer under Dragon's wing, a mirror to his canon self. The trio of Luffy, Ace, and Sabo would still exist, but their destinies would diverge in new and complex ways. All of this paints a picture of a Marine institution reshaped by Dragon's presence. He would not change it overnight. He would not magically purge corruption. But he would introduce a new philosophy, a new way of thinking that could inspire countless others. At the same time, he would create fractures within the system, making it unstable. The Marines might look stronger on the surface, but beneath that surface, ideological battles would rage. The seeds of internal conflict would grow. This, then, is the paradox of Dragon's Marine career. By staying, he strengthens the institution with his power, leadership, and ideals, but he also weakens it by exposing its contradictions, by challenging its authority, by dividing its soldiers' loyalties. The world government wants obedient enforcers, not reformers. Dragon, by his very nature, cannot be obedient forever. Sooner or later, his revolutionary justice would clash with the absolute authority of the celestial dragons. The only question is whether that clash happens while he is still wearing the Marine uniform or after he once again decides he cannot stay. In this timeline, we assume he never makes that break. He never founds the Revolutionary Army. He never becomes the world's most wanted man. Instead, he channels all his energy into transforming the Marines from within. This choice reshapes the entire world. The Revolutionary Army never rises to oppose the world government. Instead, the only opposition comes from pirates. The Marines become both more compassionate and more divided, and Dragon becomes the central figure in a battle for the soul of justice itself. When we picture the Marines in the world of One Piece, we often think of them as a single monolithic institution. But the truth is, the Marines are a fractured body, full of competing visions of justice. Each high-ranking officer interprets justice in their own way, and the soldiers beneath them often follow suit. This is why, under Sengoku's leadership, you could have officers like Akainu and Aokiji working side by side despite embodying philosophies that could not be further apart. Inserting Monkey D. Dragon into this equation dramatically reshapes the internal landscape. His vision is not one of fear, nor one of passivity, but one of active reform. If Dragon had stayed within the Marines, the organization would not simply have more muscle. It would have a new ideological core, one that threatened to redefine the very meaning of justice. To understand the impact, imagine Dragon as a vice admiral commanding fleets. He is respected, feared by pirates, and admired by soldiers who have grown tired of orders that seem disconnected from the lives of ordinary people. When Dragon leads a mission, his troops know they will not be treated as expendable pawns. He will strategize carefully to minimize losses. He will ensure civilians are not slaughtered needlessly. And when victory comes, it will not just be a tally of captured pirates, but a moment in which people genuinely feel protected. This approach would begin to set Dragon apart. Word would spread among Marines that serving under Dragon was different. His troops were safer, his victories more meaningful, and his justice more humane. The Marines are an institution where morale is everything. Soldiers who believe in their commander fight harder, endure longer, and trust in their cause. Dragon's leadership would slowly build an invisible faction. These soldiers might not speak openly about their loyalty, but in their hearts, they would follow Dragon before they followed the Celestial Dragons or even the Fleet Admiral. This kind of influence is dangerous in a hierarchical system. It begins to blur the line between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to an individual. The Gorosei would eventually see the signs, but at first, Dragon's rise would be subtle, his reputation spreading quietly like fire beneath the floorboards. As Dragon ascends, the philosophies of justice among the admirals and vice admirals begin to shift. Akainu's absolute justice had long been dominant, demanding that pirates and criminals be eradicated without mercy. Kizaru's detached justice often meant avoiding responsibility, simply carrying out orders without questioning their morality. Aokiji's lazy justice, though more humane, still avoided confrontation with the system's rot. Dragon's justice would be revolutionary by comparison. He would push the Marines to question why they fought, not just how they fought. He would ask what true justice meant in a world where celestial dragons could enslave innocent people and call it law. These questions, once raised, cannot be unasked. For the first time, many Marines would begin to see the contradictions in their role. This would create tension within the upper ranks. Sengoku, who served as Fleet Admiral for a large part of Dragon's rise, was pragmatic. He valued results, stability, and control. Dragon's idealism would worry him. Sengoku might appreciate Dragon's effectiveness, but fear that his philosophy could fracture the institution. Tsuru, always sharp and pragmatic, might quietly support Dragon's compassion, but caution him against open rebellion. Meanwhile, Akainu would despise him outright. To Sakazuki, there is no room for compromise. To question orders is to undermine justice itself. The two would inevitably clash, not only in philosophy, but in practice. Picture a major mission where the two ideologies collide. Perhaps a rebellion breaks out in a kingdom under celestial dragon influence. The rebels are civilians, starved and desperate, but the world government labels them as criminals. Akainu would demand total eradication. Dragon, however, would argue for negotiation, for addressing the root cause of suffering. If the two were sent together, the mission would end in chaos. Dragon would try to restrain Akainu's brutality, and Akainu would accuse Dragon of betrayal. In the end, Sengoku would have to mediate, but the rift between them would only deepen. Marines who witnessed this would remember, and their loyalties would slowly begin to shift. As Dragon's faction grew, the internal structure of the Marines would start to bend. Lower-ranking officers, who sympathized with civilians, who resented protecting celestial dragons, would gravitate toward Dragon's vision. They might not openly defy orders, but in moments of crisis, they would look to Dragon for guidance rather than to headquarters. This creates an invisible dual hierarchy, the official chain of command and the unofficial loyalty to Dragon. In times of peace, this could remain hidden, but in times of war, when decisions had to be made quickly, the cracks would become visible. Soldiers might hesitate to carry out cruel orders, citing Dragon's example. They might act with more compassion, undermining the absolute control the world government demanded. The celestial dragons themselves would view Dragon with suspicion and hatred. These self-proclaimed gods thrive on obedience. To them, Marines are tools to protect their privilege, nothing more. A Marine who openly questions their authority, even subtly, is unacceptable. They would pressure the Gorosei to act. The Gorosei, however, are pragmatic. They would see Dragon's usefulness as long as he continued to deliver victories against pirates. But they would also begin planning for the day when he became too dangerous. Surveillance, manipulation, and subtle sabotage would be employed to keep him in check. This would become a silent war between Dragon's ideals and the celestial dragon's demands, fought not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. Dragon's leadership style would also impact the Marines' broader policies. Take the Buster Call, for example. This weapon of mass destruction, meant to annihilate islands deemed a threat, symbolizes the world government's ruthless authority. In canon, the Buster Call was executed on O'Hara, wiping out innocent scholars in the name of suppressing forbidden knowledge. If Dragon had remained in the Marines during that period, his presence would have changed everything. Would he have obeyed the order to annihilate O'Hara? Or would he have refused, risking his career and perhaps even his life? The answer depends on how far Dragon was willing to go within the system. Even if he could not stop the Buster Call outright, his objections would resonate. Marines under his influence might hesitate, delay, or minimize the damage. Survivors might owe their lives to Dragon's quiet defiance. The incident would still scar him deeply, fueling his determination to reform the Marines from within. Another key policy area is the Shichibukai system. This arrangement, where powerful pirates are legitimized by the world government in exchange for their service, is one of the clearest examples of hypocrisy. Pirates who commit atrocities are forgiven if they align with government interests. Dragon would despise this system. He would argue that it undermines justice, rewards criminals, and betrays the very civilians the Marines are meant to protect. His opposition could lead to heated debates within the Marine leadership. Sengoku might defend the system as a pragmatic necessity, while Akainu would view it as a means to an end. Dragon, however, would see it as corruption personified. His dissent would not dismantle the system immediately, but it would plant seeds of doubt within the ranks. Over time, more Marines might begin to question why they are forced to cooperate with pirates while punishing ordinary rebels. Dragon's influence would also reshape recruitment and training. As a commanding officer, he would mentor young Marines differently. Instead of teaching them blind obedience, he would emphasize critical thinking, empathy, and moral courage. Recruits trained under him would emerge with a different outlook, one less aligned with the world government's rigid demands. These recruits, dispersed throughout the institution, would quietly spread his ideals. Within a generation, the Marines could look very different, shaped not only by the fear of punishment, but by a genuine desire to protect people. But such change never comes without resistance. Akainu and his allies would see this shift as dangerous, a dilution of Marine authority. They would accuse Dragon of corrupting the youth, of weakening discipline, of betraying justice. Political battles would erupt within headquarters, sometimes subtle, sometimes explosive. In meetings, Dragon would argue passionately for reforms, while Akainu would demand harsher crackdowns. Sengoku, caught in the middle, would struggle to maintain unity. The Marines, outwardly united, would be internally fractured by ideological warfare. The world outside would also begin to notice. Pirates, revolutionary-minded civilians, and oppressed kingdoms would hear rumors of a Marine admiral who opposed tyranny. Some would begin to see the Marines in a new light, not merely as enforcers of oppression, but as a potential force for liberation. This would complicate the global balance of power. Pirates might hesitate to attack civilians, fearing that Dragon himself would intervene. Rebels might hold out hope that Marines under Dragon's command would treat them with compassion. At the same time, the world government would work harder to suppress such rumors, terrified of Dragon's growing legend. This is the irony of Dragon's hypothetical Marine career. By staying within the system, he strengthens it militarily and ideologically, but he also destabilizes it politically. The Marines would become more effective in protecting civilians, but less reliable as tools of the celestial dragons. The Gorosei would face an impossible dilemma. Keep Dragon and risk him transforming the Marines, or remove him and risk open rebellion within the ranks. Either choice weakens their grip on power. As Dragon's faction grows, the possibility of an internal Marine civil war becomes real. Imagine a future where Akainu leads one half of the Marines, enforcing absolute justice with brutal efficiency, while Dragon leads the other half, championing reform and compassion. The two factions might still fight pirates together when necessary, but beneath the surface, they are preparing for an inevitable clash. The Marines become a battleground, not just against pirates, but for the very soul of justice. This tension would ripple outward into every major event of the era. Consider Marineford. In canon, this war was a showcase of Marine authority, a battle designed to crush Whitebeard and his allies while executing Ace. If Dragon were a high-ranking Marine at that time, everything would change. Would he support the execution of Ace, the son of Goldie Roger, knowing the suffering it would cause and the cycle of hatred it would fuel? Or would he oppose it, arguing that executing a man for his lineage is unjust? His stance could divide the admirals, perhaps even delaying the execution long enough for different outcomes. The war itself might unfold differently, with Dragon's faction fighting to preserve civilians caught in the crossfire, rather than focusing solely on annihilation. The entire event, which canonically reinforced the world government's dominance, might instead expose its fractures to the world. Dragon's justice, then, is not merely a philosophy. It is a force of transformation. Within the Marines, it inspires loyalty, creates factions, and changes the culture of recruitment and training. Outside the Marines, it alters how the world perceives the institution, shifting it from a symbol of oppression to a potential beacon of hope. But this transformation comes at a cost. The internal contradictions grow sharper, the tensions more dangerous, and the risk of collapse greater. The Marines might become stronger in one sense, but weaker in another, torn apart by competing visions of justice. Ultimately, Dragon's presence within the Marines creates a paradox. He is both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. He leads them to greater victories, inspires greater loyalty, and reshapes their image in the eyes of the world. But he also divides them, challenges their obedience, and threatens the authority of the very government they serve. In this timeline, the Marines are no longer a unified tool of the celestial dragons. They are an institution at war with themselves, struggling to decide whether justice means obedience to power or compassion for the people. And at the center of it all stands Monkey D. Dragon, the man who could have been their savior or their undoing. The world government presents itself as the eternal pillar of order. To the people of the world, it is the institution that protects them from the chaos of pirates, from the instability of kingdoms, and from the terror of lawlessness. But behind this carefully cultivated facade lies a system rooted in tyranny, secrecy, and the preservation of celestial dragon privilege. At the top sit the Gorosei, 5 men who shape policy with cold calculation, and above them, hidden in the shadows, the mysterious figure of Imu, whose existence is unknown to almost everyone. For centuries, the world government has survived not simply because of its military might, but because of its ability to maintain control. It manipulates information, silences dissent, and crushes any threats before they grow too large. In this system, the Marines are not protectors of the people, but the shield of the ruling elite. So what happens when one of the most influential Marines in history is not fully loyal to that order? Dragon's presence inside the Marines is a thorn in the side of the world government. On paper, he is their perfect weapon, a man of immense strength, charisma, and strategic brilliance, capable of leading fleets and inspiring fear in pirates. But in practice, he represents a dangerous deviation from obedience. Unlike Akainu, who embodies their desire for brutal enforcement, or Kizaru, who embodies unquestioning compliance, Dragon embodies doubt. He questions orders, criticizes policies, and inspires others to think critically about their duties. For the Gorosei, this is unacceptable. A soldier who fights too effectively but refuses to be controlled can be more dangerous than an enemy outside their ranks. The first way the world government would respond is by monitoring Dragon carefully. The Cypherpol agencies, particularly CP0, would be tasked with surveillance. His conversations would be recorded, his allies cataloged, his missions scrutinized for signs of insubordination. This constant observation would be designed to keep him in check and gather evidence in case the Gorosei decided to eliminate him, but surveillance alone would not solve the problem. The more Dragon's reputation grew, the harder it would be to quietly discredit him. Soldiers admired him, civilians respected him, and pirates feared him. He was becoming too visible to erase. The Gorosei's second tactic would be manipulation. They might attempt to exploit Dragon's sense of justice by feeding him selective missions. For example, they could assign him to areas where he could achieve genuine victories for civilians, hoping that his satisfaction would make him less rebellious. Or, they might place him in politically sensitive situations where his actions would indirectly benefit their goals, even if he thought he was acting independently. The idea would be to redirect his energy rather than confront it directly. But Dragon is not naive. He would recognize when he was being used, and over time, he would grow increasingly resistant to manipulation. Eventually, the Gorosei would consider sabotage. One possibility would be to engineer missions that forced Dragon into moral compromises, hoping to tarnish his reputation. Imagine a scenario where Dragon is ordered to protect a kingdom allied with the world government, only to discover that the king is a tyrant. If Dragon protects the king, civilians will see him as complicit in oppression. If he refuses, the world government can brand him a traitor. These no-win scenarios would be deliberate traps designed to erode his influence. Yet Dragon's charisma and cleverness could allow him to find creative solutions, defying expectations and strengthening his legend instead of weakening it. The ultimate fear of the Gorosei is not just Dragon himself, but the idea of Dragon. The Marines are the most powerful military force in the world, but they are only effective because they are unified under the authority of the world government. If soldiers begin to see themselves as loyal to Dragon's philosophy, rather than to the celestial dragons, the entire structure collapses. It would no longer matter how many admirals they had, or how many fleets they controlled. A divided marine force is a weakened one, and if the largest army in the world no longer serves the rulers, their reign becomes fragile. At this stage, Imu's role becomes crucial. Imu is the hidden sovereign, the one who sits on the empty throne despite its supposed symbolism of equality. Imu does not tolerate threats. When something or someone endangers the stability of the world order, Imu acts decisively. We saw this with the destruction of Leloucha, a kingdom erased from the map in a single blast of power. If Dragon rose too far within the Marines, if his ideals spread too widely, Imu might decide that the risk was too great. In this scenario, we can imagine conversations in the Room of Authority, where the Gorosei present their concerns and Imu silently considers the fate of Monkey D. Dragon. Should he be destroyed before his influence grows beyond control, or is his power too useful to discard? But eliminating Dragon is not easy. He is immensely strong, cunning, and surrounded by loyal subordinates. A direct assassination attempt might fail, and even if it succeeded, the fallout would be catastrophic. Soldiers who admired him would suspect foul play. Rumors would spread. Martyring Dragon could turn him into a symbol far more powerful in death than in life. This paradox is one of the greatest dilemmas the world government would face in this timeline. Keeping him risks transformation of the Marines. Killing him risks rebellion. Another layer of tension lies in Dragon's heritage. As the son of Garp, he carries immense symbolic weight. Garp himself resisted promotions because he refused to serve the celestial dragons, but he remained loyal enough to avoid execution. Dragon is different. He is willing to rise through the ranks, which makes him more visible, more influential, and therefore more dangerous. Yet the Gorosei would hesitate to move against him because of Garp. The hero of the Marines is not someone they can easily defy. If they harmed his son, Garp's wrath could destabilize the institution even further. In this way, Dragon's lineage protects him, at least temporarily, from the fate that might befall a less connected officer. Over time, however, the Gorosei would begin to shape long-term strategies. One possibility is that they would attempt to balance Dragon by promoting opposing figures. Akainu, for instance, would become their weapon of choice. By elevating Sakazuki's philosophy of absolute justice, they create a counterweight to Dragon's reformist vision. Whenever Dragon argues for compassion, Akainu argues for eradication. Whenever Dragon questions an order, Akainu enforces it without hesitation. The two become ideological poles within the Marines, each pulling soldiers in different directions. From the Gorosei's perspective, this internal division is preferable to Dragon dominating outright. Better a fractured Marine force than one entirely loyal to a reformer. Yet this strategy carries risks. Division weakens efficiency, and the world outside is not forgiving. Pirates are growing stronger. Yonko territories are expanding, and the balance of power is fragile. If the Marines are too divided, they may fail to contain threats. The Shichibukai system, the Yonko, and the rise of new pirate crews all demand unity. The Gorosei might find themselves in the dangerous position of relying on Dragon's strength, even as they fear his ideals. This contradiction would define their relationship with him for decades. They need him, but they cannot control him. The absence of the Revolutionary Army in this timeline also changes the Gorosei's calculus. In Canyon, Dragon is the leader of the greatest threat to their power. His revolutionary army undermines kingdoms, liberates slaves, and openly declares war on the celestial dragons. Without that external threat, the Gorosei can focus on pirates as their main enemies. But Dragon inside the Marines creates a more insidious problem. Instead of fighting a rebel outside their walls, they are fighting an idea spreading inside their ranks. It is harder to crush, harder to identify, and harder to fight without weakening themselves. In some ways, Dragon as a Marine is more dangerous than Dragon as a revolutionary, precisely because he operates within their system. Let us consider a specific moment. The Reverie, the grand gathering of kings from around the world. In canon, this is a stage where political alliances are reinforced and where the celestial dragons flaunt their dominance. If Dragon were a Marine Admiral or even Fleet Admiral during such an event, his presence would be a problem. How could the celestial dragons act with impunity, abusing slaves and humiliating monarchs. While a high-ranking Marine who opposes tyranny stood in the room, Dragon might not openly defy them, but his silent disapproval would be noticed. Other leaders might draw courage from his presence, daring to question the world government more openly. The Gorosei would find themselves under greater pressure, struggling to maintain the illusion of absolute control. Another moment worth reimagining is the O'Hara incident. In canon, the Buster Call was carried out without mercy, annihilating innocent scholars in the name of suppressing knowledge. If Dragon had been present as a high-ranking officer, his actions could change everything. Perhaps he would argue against the annihilation, citing the injustice of murdering civilians for research. Perhaps he would try to minimize the destruction, rescuing survivors, or delaying the fleet. Even if he failed to stop the massacre, his opposition would be remembered by those who survived. Nico Robin, for instance, might grow up knowing that one Marine tried to help. One Marine stood against the tide. This would reshape her perception of the world and potentially alter her future alliances. For the Gorosei, however, Dragon's defiance in such an incident would be intolerable. It would prove that he is not a tool, but a liability. As Dragon's career continues, the possibility of him becoming Fleet Admiral becomes real. Sengoku eventually retires, and the succession battle begins. In canon, it came down to Akainu and Aokiji, a clash of philosophies that nearly tore the Marines apart. But in this timeline, Dragon would be the third contender. His charisma, reputation, and results would make him a strong candidate. Soldiers would rally behind him, desperate for a leader who truly embodies justice. The Gorosei, however, would panic. A Fleet Admiral Dragon is their worst nightmare, a reformer in the highest position of Marine authority. If he won, he could reshape policies, reassign resources, and openly challenge the celestial dragons. The balance of the entire world would tilt. The succession battle, then, would become more than just a fight between Akainu and Aokiji. It would become a three-way struggle, with Dragon representing the reformist vision, Aokiji representing moderate justice, and Akainu representing absolute obedience. Soldiers would split along these lines, and the institution could fracture permanently. The Gorosei might intervene directly, manipulating the process to block Dragon from winning. They could rig the outcome in Akainu's favor, citing his loyalty and ruthlessness. But such manipulation would not erase Dragon's popularity. Even if denied the position, his supporters would remain loyal to him, creating a permanent faction within the Marines. At this stage, Imu might finally make a decision. If Dragon is denied the Fleet Admiral position, but continues to spread his ideals, he becomes too dangerous to tolerate. Imu could order his elimination, perhaps using the same mysterious weapon that erased Leloucha. But unlike a small kingdom, Dragon cannot be erased quietly. His death would shake the Marines to their core, sparking suspicion, anger, and potentially rebellion. Soldiers might desert, kingdoms might question their allegiance, and pirates might exploit the chaos. Imu's decision would therefore be fraught with risk. The broader world would also react differently to a marine dragon. Pirates like Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido would view him as a unique threat, a marine who does not act predictably. Some might respect him for his compassion. Others might fear him for his strategic brilliance. Revolutionary-minded civilians, who in canon would join his army, might instead whisper his name as the only just marine, secretly hoping he could reform the system from within. Dragon's existence blurs the lines between hero and villain, marine and revolutionary, order and rebellion. He becomes a paradox the world government cannot resolve. In the end, the Gorosei and Imu would find themselves in a constant state of unease. Dragon is too strong to discard, too principled to manipulate, and too popular to erase without consequences. Their entire system, built on control and obedience, would begin to feel fragile. Every time Dragon questions an order, every time he protects civilians against noble interests, every time he inspires soldiers to think for themselves, the foundations of their rule tremble. The world government has survived for 800 years by silencing threats before they grow. But in this timeline, the greatest threat is not outside their walls. It is inside, wearing the uniform of their own Marines. This is the irony of Dragon's choice in our what-if scenario. By staying within the Marines, he does not simply alter battles or policies. He alters the very heart of the world order. The Gorose's strategies of control, manipulation, and suppression no longer work as effectively. Imu's hidden sovereignty is no longer secure. The celestial dragon's authority is no longer absolute. Dragon's revolutionary ideals, contained within the system rather than opposing it, become even more dangerous because they expose the contradictions of the world government from the inside out. The Revolutionary Army is one of the most important forces in the world of One Piece. It is not simply another pirate crew or a scattered rebellion. It is a global organization with structure, leadership, and a vision to overthrow the world government. Dragon is the architect of that movement. His charisma, intelligence, and sheer willpower make him the only person capable of uniting scattered rebels into a single coordinated force. Without him, the Revolutionary Army does not exist in the same form, and perhaps does not exist at all. This changes everything. When Dragon remains in the Marines, the world loses its strongest organized resistance to tyranny. The vacuum left by the absent Revolutionary Army alters the destinies of countless individuals, kingdoms, and even the balance of power itself. To begin, we must consider the people who in canon became Dragon's closest allies. Emporio Ivankov, the queen of the Kamabaka kingdom, is a flamboyant and powerful figure who joined Dragon because of their shared ideals. Bartholomew Kuma, the gentle giant from the Sorbet kingdom, became Dragon's most loyal comrade, sacrificing his own body for the revolutionary cause. Sabo, the adopted brother of Luffy and Ace, was rescued by Dragon and found his purpose in fighting for freedom. Without Dragon to unite them, these individuals walk different paths. Take Ivankov first. In the world we know, Ivankov is one of Dragon's key commanders, spreading the revolutionary message and aiding in the liberation of oppressed peoples. Without Dragon, Ivankov likely remains a local leader of the Kamabaka kingdom. The island's unique culture of acceptance and defiance might inspire some nearby allies, but it would never become a global movement. Ivankov's flamboyant energy and charisma are powerful, but without Dragon's strategic vision, the influence of Kamabaka would be confined to its borders. Ivankov might still clash with the world government from time to time, but these would be isolated events, not coordinated campaigns. Bartholomew Kuma's fate becomes even darker without Dragon. In canon, Kuma is a former king who turns against the world government after seeing the suffering of his people. Dragon gives him a purpose, a cause larger than himself. Without Dragon, Kuma would likely resist the world government alone, perhaps leading small rebellions in Sorbet. But a single king cannot stand against the combined power of Marines, Cypher Pole, and the celestial dragons. His rebellion would be crushed, his people enslaved or executed, and Kuma himself might be captured much earlier. Instead of willingly becoming a cyborg under Vegapunk's program in service of Dragon's goals, Kuma might be forcibly turned into a weapon of the world government with no agency at all. The gentle man who chose to sacrifice himself for the greater good would instead become another tragic victim. Then there is Sabo. In canon, his near death at the hands of a celestial dragon led Dragon to rescue him, setting him on the path to becoming the Revolutionary Army's chief of staff. Without Dragon, there is no rescue. Sabo likely dies that day in Goa, struck down by the celestial dragon's cannon. Even if by some miracle he survives, he has no dragon to guide him, no revolutionary army to join. His hatred of the nobility would still burn, but without an outlet it might consume him. Perhaps he would become a pirate, channeling his rage into lawlessness rather than organized resistance. But the world would lose the version of Sabo who became a global revolutionary. a symbol of defiance. Beyond individuals, the absence of the Revolutionary Army reshapes the destinies of entire kingdoms. Dressrosa, for instance, suffered under Doflamingo's tyranny. In canon, the Revolutionary Army kept watch over kingdoms like this, waiting for opportunities to support rebellion. Without Dragon's network, the people of Dressrosa would remain under Doflamingo's heel much longer. The Marines might intervene eventually, but only if it served the world government's interests. The civilians would continue to suffer, enslaved by the smile factories and manipulated by lies. The Goa Kingdom itself, where Dragon famously saved people during the Grey Terminal fire, would also be different. In canon, Dragon appeared with his ship, rescuing the downtrodden and recruiting them into his cause. Without him, those people die in the flames or remain forgotten in the shadows. The kingdom continues its oppression without challenge. The message to the world is clear. No one will come to save you. The weak must endure, because the world government will not intervene. Other oppressed kingdoms, like those suffering under corrupt kings who serve the celestial dragons, would face the same fate. In canon, the Revolutionary Army liberates some of these nations, giving hope to others. Without that symbol of resistance, rebellions would still happen, but they would be scattered, isolated, and easily crushed. The people of the world would believe the world government is invincible. The idea of freedom, of liberation, would seem like a dream too distant to grasp. This absence also shifts the balance of power at the global level. In canon, the world government juggles three great forces: the Marines, the Yonko, and the Revolutionary Army. Each balances the other, preventing any one side from dominating. Without the Revolutionary Army, the triangle collapses into a simpler equation: Marines versus pirates. On the surface, this seems like a strengthening of the world government's position. One enemy removed, one less front to worry about. But this simplification comes with hidden dangers. For one, the Yonko face less pressure. The Revolutionary Army occasionally interferes with their territories, disrupting their control. Without Dragon, the Yonko expand more freely. Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido tighten their grips, unopposed except by the Marines. The Marines, meanwhile, are stretched thinner, forced to focus entirely on containing pirate activity. The absence of the Revolutionary Army means there is no one attacking the world government's political legitimacy. Pirates fight for treasure and territory, not for ideology. As long as the Marines contain them, the system itself remains unchallenged. This leads to a more stagnant world. The oppressed suffer quietly. The Yonko consolidate their empires, and the Marines enforce the status quo. Innovation, rebellion, and hope diminish. Dragon's greatest contribution in canon is not just his battles, but his ability to inspire people with the idea that the world government can be defeated. Without that idea, people stop dreaming of change. They accept their chains as unbreakable. Another important consequence is the fate of information. The Revolutionary Army is one of the few groups that actively seeks to uncover the truths hidden by the world government, including the secrets of the Void Century. Without Dragon's network, much of this knowledge remains buried. The scholars of Ohara are gone, the poneglyphs remain unstudied, and the truth of history stays locked away. Nico Robin, the only survivor of Ohara, has no revolutionary army to join. Perhaps she becomes a pirate earlier, wandering alone, or perhaps she is captured by the world government much sooner. Either way, the effort to uncover history slows dramatically. The dream of finding the Rio poneglyph and exposing the truth to the world becomes far less likely. But perhaps the most tragic outcome of all is the psychological effect on ordinary people. In canon, whenever a kingdom rises up, whenever news spreads of Dragon's victories, hope sparks. People whisper his name as a symbol of resistance. Even those who never meet him feel his presence as proof that tyranny can be challenged. Without that symbol, despair spreads. Oppression becomes normalized. The celestial dragon's abuses continue unchecked. Their slaves endure without rescue, and kingdoms pay tribute without question. The world becomes quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It becomes quieter because resistance has been smothered before it could grow. Yet there is another side to this absence. The energy that would have gone into the Revolutionary Army does not vanish. Human beings do not stop longing for freedom simply because Dragon is absent. Instead, that energy redirects. Some may become pirates, seeking liberation through lawlessness. Others may attempt local uprisings, even if doomed to fail. Still others may look to sympathetic Marines, like Dragon himself in this timeline, as symbols of hope. In other words, the revolutionary spirit does not disappear. It fragments. Instead of one coordinated army, the world is filled with countless smaller resistances. These are easier for the world government to crush, but they are harder to predict. A kingdom might rise up unexpectedly, forcing Marines to intervene. Pirates might claim they are liberators, blurring the line between outlaw and revolutionary. The absence of the Revolutionary Army makes the world less organized, but more chaotic. For Dragon himself, this creates an ironic burden. By staying in the Marines, he deprives the world of the Revolutionary Army he would have led. Instead, he becomes the focus of hope for all those who might have joined him. Civilians look to him as the one Marine who truly cares. Disillusioned soldiers follow him rather than the world government. Oppressed kingdoms pray that he, not the celestial dragons, will intervene in their suffering. Dragon becomes a singular figure, carrying the weight of resistance on his shoulders. He is not leading an army of rebels, but he is leading a silent army of expectations. The world's pirates, too, respond differently to this absence. Some, like Whitebeard, who values family and territory, may find themselves less challenged in protecting their people. Others, like Blackbeard, may see the lack of organized resistance as an opportunity to rise faster. In canon, Blackbeard thrives in chaos, exploiting the weaknesses created by the balance of power. In this timeline, the balance is different. Without a revolutionary threat, the world government focuses more on pirates, perhaps delaying Blackbeard's rise or forcing him to adapt his plans. Still, the absence of the Revolutionary Army leaves him free to maneuver without worrying about ideological rivals. Even the Straw Hat's journey would be affected. Luffy, Robin, and others encounter the Revolutionary Army at key points in their story. Without it, their paths change. Luffy never learns that his father is the leader of a global rebellion. Instead, he learns that his father is a Marine. Robin never gains the protection of the revolutionaries, making her far more vulnerable. The Straw Hats themselves might carry more of the burden of uncovering history and opposing tyranny, because there is no larger movement to support them. Their journey becomes lonelier, their victories more precarious, and their enemies more overwhelming. In a strange way, the absence of the Revolutionary Army also makes Dragon's role inside the Marines even more critical. Without an external rebellion, he is the only force challenging the world government's corruption. Every act of compassion he shows, every order he questions, every policy he opposes becomes more significant. He cannot rely on an army to spread his ideals. He can only rely on himself, his influence, and the soldiers who admire him. This makes his battle lonelier, but also more heroic. The weight of the world rests on his shoulders in a way that it never did in canon. The world without the Revolutionary Army, then, is a darker one. Oppressed kingdoms remain in chains. Individuals like Kuma, Ivankov, and Sabo never reach their potential. Knowledge of history remains buried. Pirates expand unchecked. Civilians despair, and the world government grows stronger in appearance, but weaker in truth. The illusion of control is maintained, but the seeds of chaos grow beneath the surface. Dragon, by staying in the Marines, removes the world's greatest organized resistance. Yet at the same time, he becomes a different kind of revolutionary. One who fights from within, carrying alone the burden that in canon he shared with countless allies. The irony is profound. By choosing the Marines, Dragon makes the world quieter, less hopeful, and more stagnant. Yet his very presence within that system plants seeds of defiance that might one day bloom in unexpected ways. Without the Revolutionary Army, history does not stop moving. It simply moves more slowly, more painfully, and with fewer chances for liberation. The question remains, will Dragon's influence within the Marines be enough to compensate for the loss of the army he never founded? Or has the world lost more than it gained by his choice? When we imagine the world of One Piece, Monkey D. Luffy's journey is inseparable from the absence of his father. Dragon is a shadow, a distant name whispered as the most wanted man alive. But he never raised Luffy, never guided him, never told him what justice was. Instead, it was Garp who tried, and failed, to mold him into a Marine. Daden and the bandits became his family, and Ace and Sabo became his brothers. Luffy's dream of becoming Pirate King came not from parental influence, but from his encounter with Shanks and the spark of freedom that ignited inside him. But what if his father was not a ghostly revolutionary, but instead a towering presence inside the Marines? What if, from the beginning, Luffy grew up as the son of a Marine Admiral or Vice Admiral Dragon? How would that alter his path, his dreams, and the story we know? First, we must establish the environment of Luffy's childhood. In this timeline, Dragon is not an outlaw, but a decorated Marine officer. That means Luffy's name carries different weight. He is not whispered about as the son of the most wanted man in the world. He is respected, or perhaps pitied, as the son of a man loyal to the world government. Civilians in East Blue might admire his father, calling him a hero, a protector of peace. Others, more skeptical, might see Dragon as a rigid enforcer of authority. Either way, Luffy grows up with his father's identity being public knowledge, not a secret revealed later. This alone changes the way he views himself. Garp's role would also shift. In canon, Garp constantly visits Luffy, trying to force him into Marine training, but there is always a note of irony, because Garp knows Dragon is a revolutionary. He is trying to keep his grandson away from his son's outlaw path. In this alternate world, that irony vanishes. Both Garp and Dragon are Marines, though with very different philosophies. Garp still wants Luffy to become a Marine, and now Dragon would also push for it, though for different reasons. Garp would want him to follow orders and maintain the family's Marine legacy. Dragon, however, would want him to embody a more compassionate, reformist vision of justice. Luffy would be tugged in two directions, both within the Marine framework, but both in tension with his own wild heart. The Daden bandits might still raise him, but the context changes. Instead of being hidden away because his father is an outlaw, Luffy would be sent to Daden as part of Garp's usual eccentric parenting style. Dragon's duties would keep him away, but unlike in canon, his absence would not feel like abandonment. Luffy would grow up knowing his father is busy protecting the world, fighting pirates, and commanding fleets. This would fill him with pride, but also with distance. He might look up to Dragon as a hero, but also feel the sting of not having him present. His rebellion would not be against an absent revolutionary, but against an absent Marine hero who tried to shape his destiny from afar. This raises the question, would Luffy still want to be Pirate King? His personality suggests yes. Luffy is a force of nature, defined by his love of freedom, adventure, and the sea. His dream to become Pirate King is about having the most freedom, not about treasure or power. Even if his father were a Marine, Luffy's innate nature would pull him toward piracy. But the decision would feel heavier. In canon, Luffy's piracy is simply rebellion against the world's laws and his grandfather's wishes. In this timeline, it is also rebellion against his father's legacy. Every step he takes as a pirate would feel like a rejection of the marine justice his family represents. This tension would haunt his journey in ways we never see in canon. Consider his bond with Shanks. In canon, Shanks is free to inspire Luffy without interference. But in this timeline, a young boy inspired by a pirate might be seen as scandalous. Garp would try harder to break that influence, and Dragon might also step in. Imagine Dragon visiting Luffy after learning about Shanks' hat, warning him that pirates are dangerous, corrupt, and unworthy of admiration. Yet Luffy, stubborn as always, would cling to that dream. The clash between father and son would become inevitable. Now let us look at Ace and Sabo. Ace's situation is particularly complicated. He is the son of Goldie Roger, the Pirate King, a fact that is dangerous no matter what timeline we imagine. In canon, Garp takes responsibility for raising Ace, partly because Dragon is absent. But in this alternate timeline, Dragon is present as a Marine. Would Dragon allow Ace to live freely? Or would he see him as a liability? Dragon's philosophy of compassion might lead him to protect Ace, much like Garp did, arguing that children should not pay for the sins of their fathers. If so, Ace would still grow up alongside Luffy. But the pressure would be even greater. He would be the son of Roger, raised by the son of Garp. That duality would weigh on him heavily. Sabo's fate also changes. In canon, Sabo's noble background and rejection of it align perfectly with Dragon's revolutionary ideals. Dragon rescues him, gives him purpose, and turns him into a leader. Without the revolutionary army, Sabo has no such outlet. If Dragon is a Marine, perhaps he still encounters Sabo in Goa, rescuing him not as a revolutionary, but as a Marine protecting a boy from a celestial dragon's cruelty. In that case, Sabo might be brought into the Marine system, trained under Dragon's philosophy. He could grow up as Luffy's counterpart, a Marine who embodies reformist justice, while Luffy becomes a pirate who embodies freedom. Their brotherhood would endure, but their paths would diverge more sharply than in canon. All three brothers, Luffy, Ace, and Sabo, would still forge their bond of brotherhood. They would still dream of freedom, but their futures would be shaped by Dragon's marine presence. Ace might still choose piracy to honor his father. Sabo might lean toward marine justice if Dragon guided him, and Luffy would still stubbornly cling to his dream of becoming Pirate King, even if it meant defying his family. The tragic irony is that Dragon, by staying in the Marines, does not make his son more obedient. He only gives his son a greater authority to rebel against. Imagine the moment when Luffy first sets out to sea. In canon, he leaves his small village quietly, with the blessing of his friends and the weight of Shanks' hat on his head. In this timeline, his departure would be far more dramatic. The son of a Marine Admiral becoming a pirate would be news. Civilians might gossip about the scandal. Marines might be ordered to bring him back. Dragon himself would face pressure from the Gorosei. How can a man who preaches justice allow his son to defy the law? Dragon would be forced into an impossible position. Does he protect his son or condemn him? His answer would define their relationship for the rest of the story. It is possible Dragon might shield Luffy quietly, pulling strings to ensure his early adventures go unnoticed. But as Luffy grows in notoriety, that becomes impossible. His battles with Buggy, Arlong, Crocodile, and others make him too visible. By the time he defeats Crocodile in Alabasta, Luffy would not just be another rookie. He would be the son of a Marine Admiral turned into one of the world's most infamous pirates. The irony would be staggering. Dragon's reputation as a reformer would clash with the reality of his son being a symbol of rebellion. The Gorosei would use this as evidence that Dragon cannot be trusted, deepening their hostility toward him. Robin's fate intersects here too. In canon, she is drawn to the Revolutionary Army after the Straw Hats save her, because she recognizes Dragon's vision. Without that army, she would still find Luffy, but the meaning would be different. Robin would see Luffy not as the son of the revolutionary leader, but as the son of a Marine. This might make her hesitant at first, unsure if she can trust him, but Luffy's actions would win her over regardless. The irony would be sharper. Robin, hunted by the world government, finding safety not with revolutionaries, but with the pirate son of a Marine admiral. The Enies Lobby incident would become even more intense. When the Straw Hats declare war on the world government to save Robin, the world would not just see it as an attack by pirates. They would see it as a direct insult to the family of Dragon. The newspapers would explode with headlines. The Marine Admiral preaching reform has a son who openly declared war on the flag of justice. Dragon's enemies within the Marines, like Akainu, would use this to discredit him. His supporters might see it as proof that even Dragon's family understands the corruption of the system. Either way, Luffy's choice to save Robin would resonate far beyond Enies Lobby. It would become a political earthquake shaking the entire Marine structure. Marineford would also look very different. In canon, Dragon is absent, leading the Revolutionary Army elsewhere, but in this timeline, he is present as a Marine. When Ace is captured and sentenced to execution, Dragon faces an impossible dilemma. Does he stand by the world government and condemn Ace, the son of Roger, to death? Or does he intervene, protecting the boy his family raised? If he chooses duty, he betrays both Garp and Luffy. If he chooses compassion, he openly defies the celestial dragons. Marineford, already the greatest battle of the era, would explode with even greater intensity. Dragon might stand on the execution platform as an admiral, while his son Luffy storms the battlefield below. Father and son would lock eyes across the chaos, embodying two opposing visions of justice and freedom. The emotional weight of that moment would surpass anything in canon. And what of Luffy himself? Would he remain the same boy we know? The cheerful, reckless dreamer who seeks freedom at all costs? In many ways, yes. Luffy's core is unshakable. He does not bend to authority, does not compromise his freedom, and does not calculate his actions based on politics. But the shadow of Dragon's Marine career would weigh on him. He would not just be Luffy, the pirate chasing a dream. He would be Luffy, the son of a Marine admiral, rebelling not just against the world, but against his own blood. That tension would define his journey. Every victory would feel heavier, every defeat more costly, because the world would not just see him as another pirate. They would see him as a symbol of defiance against the very institution his father represents. In the end, Luffy's dream to become Pirate King would remain, but the path to it would be harder, more emotionally charged, and more politically significant. His bond with Shanks would still inspire him. His crew would still rally behind him, but the weight of his father's Marine legacy would hang over him at every step. For Luffy, freedom would not just mean surpassing pirates. It would mean surpassing his own family's shadow. And for Dragon, every act of his son's rebellion would test his loyalty to the Marines, to justice, and to his own ideals. The clash between father and son would become one of the greatest conflicts in the entire One Piece world, reshaping not only their lives, but the fate of the entire era. The Great Pirate Era began the day Gol D. Roger was executed. His final words ignited the seas, telling the world that his treasure was out there, waiting for anyone bold enough to claim it. That moment was the spark that turned the seas into a cauldron of chaos. Pirates from every corner of the globe set out to find the One Piece, to claim the title of Pirate King. The Marines suddenly found themselves overwhelmed, stretched thin as the number of pirate crews exploded beyond anything they had faced before. In canon, this chaos was balanced by the rise of the Revolutionary Army on another front. But in the timeline where Dragon remains a Marine, the Revolutionary Army never rises. The energy of rebellion against tyranny is not organized, and the seas are dominated almost entirely by the clash between pirates and the Marines. The Great Pirate Era still happens, But it unfolds differently, and its consequences ripple in strange directions. The absence of the Revolutionary Army removes one of the three great forces of the world. The world government likes to claim there is balance: the Marines, the Yonko, and the Revolutionary Army. In truth, that balance is fragile. Each force exists to check the others. Pirates are too disorganized to challenge the world government's legitimacy, but they provide chaos that justifies Marine authority. The Revolutionary Army, meanwhile, exists as a constant ideological threat, showing civilians that there is an alternative to tyranny. With that third force gone, the balance collapses into something far more binary. It becomes a world defined by pirates against Marines, chaos against order, freedom against law. At first glance, this might seem like a simpler conflict. The Marines no longer have to divide their resources between suppressing revolutions and containing pirates. They can focus everything on fighting the Yonko and the countless pirate crews flooding the seas. But in practice, this focus only reveals the cracks in the system. Because without a revolutionary movement to protect the oppressed, piracy becomes the only avenue for rebellion. Civilians suffering under tyrannical kings, celestial dragon slavery, or world government negligence do not have Dragon's army to rally to. Instead, they take to piracy themselves, turning their desperation into outlaw fleets. This increases the number of pirates exponentially, creating an even larger problem for the Marines to control. The Yonko, too, gains strength in this altered world. Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido in particular face less interference. In canon, Dragon's revolutionaries operate in the shadows, liberating kingdoms and disrupting the flow of resources that the Yonko exploit. Without them, the Yonko expand more smoothly. Whitebeard's territory becomes even more stable, his protection extending over islands with less chance of rebellion. Big Mom tightens her hold on Totoland, unchallenged by revolutionary raids. Kaido's oppressive reign in Wano continues unchecked, with no underground revolutionary contacts to help the people resist. The result is that the Yonko become stronger, their grip on their territory is more secure, and their challenge to marine power more formidable. Marine policy in this timeline reflects this pressure. With Dragon's reformist influence inside the institution, the Marines treat civilians more carefully. He insists that they cannot simply crush islands to root out pirates, because doing so only creates more enemies. This makes the Marines more humane in appearance, but also more stretched thin. Every victory requires more precision, more effort, and more restraint. Akainu and others argue that this weakens the Marines, that compassion is a liability. Dragon counters that brutality fuels piracy by creating martyrs. The debates rage inside Marine headquarters, while outside, the seas descend further into chaos. The Shichibukai system also evolves differently. In canon, the 7 warlords are a compromise, using powerful pirates to stabilize the seas. Dragon despises the hypocrisy of this system. In this timeline, his opposition is louder and more consistent, making it more controversial within the Marines. Sengoku might still defend it as a pragmatic necessity, but Dragon constantly pushes to limit the warlords' power. He views them as parasites, symbols of the corruption that undermines marine justice. His influence might prevent some warlords from being legitimized at all. Characters like Crocodile, who canonically abused his position in Alabasta, might never have received the title in the first place. This alters certain arcs significantly. The people of Alabasta, for example, might still suffer under Crocodile's secret schemes, but the world government would not be able to protect him with warlord status. That could mean either the Marines intervene earlier, or the crisis escalates in a different way. Another important effect is on the way pirates are perceived by civilians. In canon, the Revolutionary Army gives oppressed people a distinction. Pirates are dangerous outlaws, but revolutionaries are liberators. Without that distinction, the line blurs. Many civilians begin to see pirates as their only hope of freedom. A pirate crew overthrowing a tyrant king might be celebrated as heroes, even if they plunder afterward. This complicates Marine efforts. Dragon himself, inside the Marines, would recognize this shift. He would argue that the world government creates pirates by refusing to address injustice. But the Gorosei would not listen. They would continue to blame everything on pirate greed, ignoring the deeper causes. The ideological divide widens. Whitebeard's era in particular benefits from this absence. As the strongest man in the world, Whitebeard acts as a protector for many islands, demanding loyalty in exchange for safety. In canon, this protection is a counterbalance to world government neglect, but the Revolutionary Army still provides an alternative. In this timeline, Whitebeard becomes the primary figure of resistance for countless civilians. His name becomes synonymous with stability in a lawless world. For many islands, the choice is simple: suffer under the Marines and celestial dragons, or seek Whitebeard's protection. Dragon, inside the Marines, would see the irony. His compassion for civilians mirrors Whitebeard's paternalism, yet they are enemies by duty. Kaido and Big Mom also benefit, though in different ways. Kaido thrives in oppression, ruling Wano with brutality and despair. Without revolutionary interference, the people of Wano remain trapped longer, their suffering hidden from the world. Big Mom, meanwhile, tightens her grip on Tado land, offering a twisted version of equality under her rule. In a world without revolution, her family structure becomes even more attractive to outsiders, despite its cruelty. The Marines cannot intervene directly in Yonko territories without sparking massive wars, so these empires grow stronger, unchecked. Blackbeard's rise is also shaped by this absence. In canon, Blackbeard maneuvers in the shadows, exploiting the chaos created by the balance of three forces. Without the Revolutionary Army, the chaos is different. Blackbeard faces fewer ideological rivals, but the Marines are more focused on containing piracy, making his rise more dangerous. Still, Blackbeard thrives on unpredictability. He might even exploit Dragon's position directly, using the controversy around the reformist Marine to sow distrust inside the institution. A Marine world divided by philosophy is the perfect playground for a pirate like him. The civilians themselves suffer the most in this altered Great Pirate era. Without the Revolutionary Army, there is no organized movement to liberate them. When pirates plunder, Marines fight back, but the collateral damage is enormous. When tyrants oppress, civilians have no larger force to call upon. Their only hope lies in isolated acts of kindness from Marines like Dragon, or protection from Yonko like Whitebeard. The dream of widespread liberation is gone. Instead, the world becomes a patchwork of chaos and fragile stability, with civilians caught in the middle. This reality also reshapes the narrative arcs of certain Straw Hat adventures. In canon, Luffy's crew sometimes intersects with the Revolutionary Army, gaining allies and support. Without them, the Straw Hats stand alone. In Alabasta, for example, Dragon's opposition to the warlord system might mean Crocodile is not protected, but it also means there is no revolutionary presence to inspire the people. Luffy's intervention becomes even more singular, his crew standing as the only real hope for the kingdom. In Dressrosa, the absence of the Revolutionary Army means no underground network watching Doflamingo. The people suffer longer, and the Straw Hats' arrival is an even more miraculous intervention. Dragon himself, within the Marines, would be forced to grapple with this reality. He knows that his decision not to form a revolutionary army leaves civilians without organized support. Every time he sees a kingdom collapse or a people suffer, he feels the weight of that absence. Yet he justifies it by believing that reform within the Marines can one day prevent such suffering altogether. His vision is long-term, systemic change rather than scattered rebellions, but the cost in the short term is immense. Entire generations suffer without hope, waiting for a system that may never reform fully. Inside Marine headquarters, the Great Pirate Era also intensifies the ideological battles. Akainu demands harsher crackdowns, arguing that compassion only fuels piracy. Dragon counters that oppression fuels rebellion, insisting that the Marines must change their relationship with civilians. The clash between these two becomes the defining struggle of Marine politics. Sengoku and Tsuru act as mediators, trying to hold the institution together, but the divide is too deep. The Marines fight pirates with one hand and fight themselves with the other. The Gorosei, watching this unfold, are deeply uneasy. They prefer a Marine institution that is united and obedient. Instead, they see an organization torn in two, one half ruthless and loyal, the other half compassionate and reformist. The Great Pirate Era was supposed to be contained through fear, but Dragon's philosophy undermines that. Soldiers under his command hesitate to carry out brutal orders, questioning whether they serve justice or tyranny. The Gorosei realize that Dragon has replaced the Revolutionary Army with something more insidious, a revolution within the Marines themselves. This altered Great Pirate Era also affects how the world perceives justice. In canon, civilians see two competing ideals: the Marines as the enforcers of law and the Revolutionary Army as liberators. In this timeline, the competition is internal. Civilians begin to notice that not all Marines are the same. Some act with cruelty, burning villages and enforcing celestial dragon authority. Others act with compassion, protecting civilians even at the cost of disobedience. Dragon's reputation grows. He becomes a legend, not just as a Marine, but as the only Marine who truly embodies justice. Civilians begin to whisper his name, not as a revolutionary, but as a hero who might reform the system from within. The irony is that Dragon still becomes a symbol of resistance, but in a completely different way. The pirates, too, respond to this shift. Some respect Dragon as a worthy opponent, one who fights with honor. Others fear him more than Akainu, because they cannot predict him. A pirate knows how to deal with cruelty, fight or flee. But how do you deal with a Marine who spares civilians, who inspires loyalty, who fights not just for power, but for principles? Dragon confuses the usual dynamic, making the Great Pirate Era more complicated than ever. By the midpoint of this era, the world is in a strange equilibrium. The Yonko are stronger, the Marines are more divided, civilians are more desperate, and pirates are more numerous. The Revolutionary Army is absent, but its energy is not gone. It has been absorbed into the chaos of piracy and the reformist faction within the Marines. The seas are bloodier, the politics sharper, and the future more uncertain. Dragon's decision to remain a Marine has not prevented the Great Pirate Era. It has only altered its shape, making it less about three balanced forces and more about two opposing visions, of justice battling inside the same institution, while the seas burn with freedom and chaos. In the end, the Great Pirate Era in this timeline is darker, more chaotic, and more tragic. Pirates become the only voice of rebellion. Civilians suffer without organized hope. The Yonko expand unchecked, and the Marines, torn between Dragon's compassion and Akainu's brutality, struggle to maintain control. Dragon himself carries the burden of knowing that his choice reshaped the world in this way. He prevented the rise of a revolutionary army, but he created a revolution inside the Marines instead. The Great Pirate Era becomes not just a battle for the One Piece, but a battle for the meaning of justice itself, played out on seas more dangerous than ever. The story of One Piece is defined not only by its characters, but also by its turning points, those world-shaking events that leave permanent scars on history. In the canon timeline, Dragon watches most of these events from afar, moving in the shadows of his revolutionary army. But in the alternate world we are imagining, Dragon is not absent. He is present, wearing the uniform of the Marines, rising through the ranks, and confronting each of these turning points from within. The question then becomes, how would these iconic moments change if Dragon's vision of justice were involved? The first great event to consider is the O'Hara incident. In canon, this tragedy marks the annihilation of an island of scholars who studied the Void Century. The world government viewed them as dangerous for seeking forbidden knowledge, and so a buster call was unleashed. Countless lives were lost. The Library of History was destroyed, and Nico Robin became the sole survivor. This massacre cemented the brutality of the world government and shaped Robin's life of mistrust and loneliness. Now imagine Dragon as a vice admiral or admiral at the time. His philosophy would make him recoil at the order to annihilate civilians whose only crime was studying history. If Dragon were involved, he might argue with Sengoku and the Gorosei, insisting that knowledge is not a crime, that wiping out an entire island is unjustifiable, even if he could not stop the Buster Call outright. His presence would alter the course of events. Perhaps Dragon would have deployed his fleet differently, rescuing as many civilians as possible before the island was destroyed. Perhaps he would have clashed with other admirals who carried out the annihilation without hesitation. His defiance would not erase the tragedy of O'Hara, but it might save more survivors. Imagine Nico Robin growing up not as the sole survivor, but as one of several, all saved by Dragon's intervention. Her view of the Marines would change profoundly. Instead of seeing them as monsters who slaughtered her people, she would remember that one admiral tried to help. One admiral opposed the massacre. Robin's mistrust of the world might be softened, and her path toward joining the Straw Hats might happen under a different emotional weight. For Dragon himself, O'Hara would become a defining moment. It would be proof that the world government is willing to commit atrocities to preserve its secrets. His defiance in this event would deepen his conflict with the Gorosei and cement his reputation as a reformist who cannot be controlled. Next comes Enies Lobby, the moment when the Straw Hats declare open war on the world government to rescue Robin. In canon, this declaration shocks the world because it comes from a small pirate crew. But in this timeline, the implications are even more explosive. Luffy is not just any pirate, he is the son of Dragon, the Marine reformer. When the Straw Hats burn the flag of the world government, it is not just an act of defiance. It is a direct insult to Dragon himself, a challenge to the institution he serves. News of this event would spread like wildfire. Newspapers would not just say, "Pirates declare war." They would say, "Son of a Marine Admiral declares war." The political fallout would be enormous. Inside Marine headquarters, debates would rage. Akainu would demand that Dragon renounce his son and hunt him down personally. The Gorosei would pressure Dragon to condemn Luffy publicly, to prove his loyalty. But Dragon's philosophy would not allow him to abandon his child, even if he disagreed with his choices. He might refuse to comment, or he might even quietly protect Luffy by diverting resources away from the pursuit. This would only deepen suspicion of him within the institution. The world would now see Dragon as compromised, a man torn between duty and family. For Luffy, the act of declaring war would take on new layers of meaning. He would not only be rebelling against the world government, he would be rebelling against his father's legacy. That tension would make Enies Lobby one of the most emotional and politically charged moments in this alternate timeline. Then there is the Summit War of Marineford, perhaps the greatest battle of the era. In canon, the Marines mobilize their full strength to execute Portghast Ace, son of the Pirate King. Whitebeard leads his fleet to rescue him, and the world watches as titans clash. Dragon is absent, his revolutionaries operating elsewhere. But in this timeline, Dragon is not absent. He is present as a high-ranking Marine, perhaps even as an admiral. His role in this war changes everything. When Ace is captured, Dragon faces an impossible dilemma. He knows Ace personally through Garp and Luffy. He knows the boy's heart and the unfairness of executing him for his bloodline. Yet as a Marine, he is ordered to participate in the execution. His two philosophies, duty and compassion, collide. If Dragon chooses obedience, he betrays his ideals and his family. If he chooses compassion, he risks open defiance against the world government in front of the entire world. This is the crucible of his career, the moment that defines him forever. Imagine the war unfolding with Dragon present. As Whitebeard's forces clash with Marine admirals, Dragon might intervene differently. Instead of focusing on annihilation, he might direct his forces to protect civilians and minimize unnecessary slaughter. He might clash directly with the Kainu, arguing that justice cannot be built on rivers of blood. When Luffy arrives on the battlefield, charging desperately to save Ace, Dragon's conflict becomes unbearable. Father and son meet not in the shadows, but in the full glare of the world stage. Their eyes lock across the battlefield, each embodying a different vision of justice. For the world, this is the image that will be remembered forever. The Marine reformer and his pirate son standing on opposite sides of the greatest war in history. If Dragon acts to protect Ace, the outcome changes drastically. Perhaps he uses his authority to delay the execution, buying precious time. Perhaps he even directly shields Ace, shocking the world by defying orders. Whitebeard's forces would rally to this unexpected ally, and the battle could turn in unpredictable directions. Ace might survive, Whitebeard's death might be postponed, and the balance of the world would tilt. But even if Dragon saves Ace, the cost would be enormous. The Gorosei would see him as a traitor. His career in the Marines would effectively end. He might even be targeted for elimination. In that sense, Marineford could become the moment when Dragon's reformist path collapses, forcing him to choose between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to his ideals. Beyond Marineford, other arcs also play out differently with Dragon's presence. Consider Dressrosa, ruled by Doflamingo. In Canyon, the Revolutionary Army keeps tabs on Doflamingo's underworld activities. Without that army, his crimes are harder to expose. But Dragon as a Marine Admiral might push for an investigation anyway. He despises the warlord system and would see Doflamingo as its most corrupt product. If Dragon pressed hard enough, the Marines might intervene in Dressrosa sooner, sparing its people years of suffering. Luffy's eventual arrival would still be crucial, but the groundwork would already be different. Civilians might see Dragon as the only Marine willing to challenge the warlords, reinforcing his legend. Another key moment is the Reverie, the gathering of kings from around the world. In canon, this event is where the Revolutionary Army declares war on the Celestial Dragons, openly opposing them. Without that army, the Reverie is quieter, but Dragon's presence as a Marine leader changes the tone. Imagine him standing in the chamber as kings bow before the Celestial Dragons, watching nobles parade their slaves. Dragon would not openly rebel. He is still within the system, but his disapproval would be palpable. Some kings might notice his silence, his refusal to endorse the cruelty. They might draw courage from his presence, daring to question policies more openly. The Reverie, instead of being the stage for revolutionary war, becomes the stage for reformist tension within the Marines. Dragon's influence ripples quietly, but powerfully. We must also consider smaller but significant arcs. Take Logtown, where Luffy is nearly executed by Buggy before Dragon intervenes in canon. In that moment, Dragon saves his son from the Marines and from fate itself. In this alternate timeline, Dragon is a Marine. Would he still intervene? The answer is likely yes, but under different circumstances. Perhaps he is present in Logtown officially, overseeing Marine activities. When he sees his son about to be executed, he steps in, not as a revolutionary savior, but as a Marine father, quietly protecting his child. The storm that saves Luffy in canon might be replaced by Dragon's unseen hand pulling strings to ensure his son survives. The result is the same. Luffy escapes, but the meaning is profoundly different. The world does not whisper about the revolutionary leader saving his son. Instead, it whispers about a Marine admiral who allowed his son to escape justice. The scandal deepens, and Dragon's reputation suffers. Even arcs like Impelled Down are reshaped. In canon, Ivankov and the Revolutionary Army play a key role in Luffy's escape. Without them, Luffy would struggle more. But if Dragon is a Marine, his influence might still echo. Perhaps he orders the prison not to execute Luffy outright, quietly ensuring his survival. Perhaps he pressures the guards to give his son more time. Again, Dragon becomes the silent protector, working within the system instead of outside it. What becomes clear as we reimagine these events is that Dragon's presence in the Marines does not erase conflict. It amplifies it. Each turning point becomes heavier, more emotionally charged, because Dragon is always caught between duty and compassion, between institution and ideals, between father and son. His decisions ripple outward, altering outcomes, but also deepening the contradictions of the world. The Marines grow more humane under his influence, but also more unstable. The world government grows more paranoid, but also more dependent on him. Luffy's journey becomes more dramatic, his defiance more personal, because he is not just fighting the world, he is fighting his own father's legacy. Ultimately, Dragon's presence in these key events highlights the paradox of his choice. By staying in the Marines, he makes them more just in some ways, but also more divided. He saves lives at O'Hara, but he cannot stop the massacre entirely. He complicates Eni's lobby, but he cannot erase the political fallout. He changes Marineford, but only by risking everything. He influences Dressrosa and Reverie, but his reforms are slow, his victories fragile. The Revolutionary Army never rises, but the revolution still burns. Inside the Marines, inside his son, and inside the hearts of those who see him defy tyranny even while wearing the uniform. The reimagined history of One Piece, with Dragon as a Marine, becomes not a story of one man leading a rebellion, but a story of one man caught in constant contradiction, reshaping every turning point of the era with his presence. And as each event unfolds, the tension builds toward an inevitable question. How long can Dragon walk this tightrope before it breaks beneath him? Every story in One Piece builds toward a final conflict, a war that will engulf the world and determine the future of the seas. In canon, this ultimate battle is expected to pit the Revolutionary Army and the pirates, especially the Straw Hats, against the world government and its hidden rulers. But in the alternate timeline we have been tracing, the Revolutionary Army never rose. Instead, Dragon stayed in the Marines, climbing through the ranks, spreading his ideals, and reshaping the institution from within. This changes the nature of the final war profoundly. It is no longer a battle of three great forces converging. Instead, it becomes a struggle defined by two competing visions inside the Marines themselves, colliding against the chaotic rise of piracy and the hidden hand of the world government. The war is still inevitable, but its shape is different, and its stakes even more complex. By this point in history, Dragon's influence inside the Marines has reached its peak. Perhaps he has become Fleet Admiral, replacing Sengoku or Akainu. Perhaps he remains an admiral, but commands such loyalty that his word carries equal weight. Either way, his faction within the Marines is powerful, rivaling the hardliners who follow Akainu's vision of absolute justice. Soldiers are divided, not by rank, but by philosophy. Some follow Dragon's compassionate, reformist justice. Others embrace Akainu's ruthless doctrine. This ideological split is no longer quiet. It is open, obvious, and dangerous. The Marines, the greatest military force in the world, are preparing for civil war, even as the seas themselves grow more unstable. Meanwhile, the Yonko are no weaker. Blackbeard's rise continues, more dangerous than ever. With the absence of the Revolutionary Army, he has fewer ideological rivals, and his ability to manipulate chaos has only grown. Kaido and Big Mom may or may not have fallen by this point, depending on Luffy's journey, but their legacies still haunt the seas. Whitebeard's death, or survival, if Dragon interfered at Marineford, still shakes the balance. And most importantly, Luffy and the Straw Hat Pirates are no longer just another crew. By now, they are central figures in the world, symbols of freedom, defiance, and the dream of the Pirate King. The seas are filled with tension, and everyone knows a final confrontation is approaching. The spark for the final war in this timeline could come from many places. Perhaps it is the revelation of the Void Century and the true history of the world, uncovered by Robin and spread by the Straw Hats. Perhaps it is the celestial dragons committing an atrocity so vile that even Dragon can no longer remain silent. Perhaps it is Emu, the hidden sovereign, deciding that the age of chaos must end through a decisive purge. Whatever the spark, the result is the same. The world descends into war, and Dragon finds himself at the center of it, not as a revolutionary leading an army from the shadows, but as a marine commander leading half of the world's greatest military force into rebellion against its own rulers. The battlefield for this war would be unlike anything seen before. In canon, Marineford was a clash of titans, but it was contained. The final war in this timeline would span continents, engulfing islands and kingdoms across the seas. Marines would fight Marines, brothers in arms turning on each other as Dragon's faction clashes with Akainu's. Civilians would rise up, inspired by the chaos, no longer restrained by fear. Pirates would flood into the fray, some fighting for freedom, others for plunder, still others for the chance to claim the One Piece. And above it all, the world government would unleash its hidden weapons, from the ancient machines hinted at in the Void Century to the terrifying force of Emu's mysterious power. Dragon's role in this war is tragic and heroic at once. As a reformer, he wanted to change the Marines from within, to make them a force of true justice. But the war proves that change cannot happen without blood. His forces clash against Akainu's, turning Marineford, or whatever headquarters exists at that time, into a battlefield not just of swords and cannons, but of ideals. Dragon commands soldiers who fight to protect civilians, to defend freedom, to oppose tyranny. Akainu commands those who believe justice can only be absolute, that order must be preserved at any cost. The two men, once colleagues, now face each other as mortal enemies, their philosophies finally colliding in the open. The Gorosei, watching this chaos, would be in panic. For centuries, the Marines were their tool, the shield that enforced their authority. Now that shield is fractured. Half of it obeys their orders, half of it obeys Dragon's conscience. The illusion of control is shattered. The celestial dragons themselves, accustomed to being untouchable, might find their palaces stormed by civilians and soldiers alike. For the first time in history, they are vulnerable. Their arrogance, their cruelty, their assumption of godhood crumbles before the fury of a world that no longer fears them. And then there is Emu. This mysterious figure, hidden on the empty throne, represents the true heart of the world government's power. In canon, Emu's role is still unclear, but hints suggest a being with access to devastating ancient weapons or powers. In this timeline, Emu cannot remain hidden. The chaos forces Emu to act. Perhaps the weapon that destroyed Lelouch is unleashed on a massive scale, wiping entire fleets from existence. Perhaps Emu reveals themselves as a near-immortal being, ruling from the shadows for centuries. Whatever the form, Emu's presence turns the final war into not just a political conflict, but an existential one. The world realizes that their rulers are not merely men, but something more, and Dragon must confront this truth directly. For Luffy, the war takes on deeply personal stakes. In canon, he fights for freedom, for his friends, for the dream of becoming Pirate King. In this timeline, he fights for all of that and more. He fights knowing his father stands on the other side, not as an absent revolutionary, but as a Marine commander. The reunion of father and son on the battlefield becomes one of the most emotional moments in the entire story. Do they fight each other? Do they join forces against Emu? Does Dragon finally break from the Marines entirely, choosing his son's vision of freedom over his own reformist ideals? The possibilities are endless, but the emotional weight is undeniable. The war is not just about the fate of the world, it is about the fate of a family that represents two opposing visions of justice. The actual battles of this war would be monumental. Imagine fleets of Marine warships turning their cannons on each other, Dragon's admirals clashing with Akainu's loyalists. Picture islands burning as pirates join the fray, their flags flying alongside civilians who finally rise against their oppressors. Envision the Straw Hats leading the charge into the heart of the world government, Robin carrying the truth of history, Zoro cutting through the strongest defenders, Sanji protecting civilians, Nami navigating chaos itself, and at the center, Luffy facing the greatest opponents of his life, determined to claim freedom for the entire world. Dragon himself would be locked in battles, both physical and ideological. His confrontation with Akainu is inevitable. These two men represent irreconcilable visions. Akainu believes justice must be absolute, merciless, and unquestioning. Dragon believes justice must be compassionate, reformist, and rooted in protecting people rather than power. Their clash would be titanic, a battle of wills as much as strength. Whoever wins defines the future of the Marines. But even this battle is only one piece of the larger war, because above them both looms Emu, the true enemy. The revelation of the Void Century would also play a role in this war. In canon, the Revolutionary Army seeks to uncover this history to expose the world government's lies. In this timeline, it falls to the Straw Hats and perhaps to Dragon's faction of Marines. Robin's research would reveal the truth, and Dragon, as a reformist, would embrace it rather than suppress it. The knowledge of the ancient kingdom, the truth of the poneglyphs, and the meaning of the D would spread across the world, fueling rebellion. Civilians would no longer see the world government as invincible guardians of order, but as usurpers who stole their thrones 8 centuries ago. The ideological war would become even fiercer, because now it is not just about justice, but about truth. The outcome of this final war is uncertain, but we can imagine several possibilities. One is that Dragon succeeds in reforming the Marines, defeating Akainu, and aligning the institution with his vision of justice. In this scenario, the Marines emerge not as tools of tyranny, but as protectors of freedom, allied with Luffy and the new era he ushers in. Another possibility is that Dragon sacrifices himself in the war, perhaps battling Emu directly, ensuring his son and his ideals survive even if he does not. In this version, Dragon becomes a martyr, his death inspiring the new world just as his life once inspired soldiers. And of course, there is the possibility that Dragon fails, that the world government crushes his rebellion and the world sinks deeper into tyranny. Though given the themes of One Piece, this outcome feels less likely. What matters most is the journey, the way Dragon's decision to remain in the Marines reshapes the nature of the war. Instead of a clear revolutionary army versus the government, it becomes a civil war inside the very institution meant to enforce order. The Marines are no longer a monolithic enemy, but a fractured battlefield, with some soldiers fighting for tyranny and others for compassion. Civilians are no longer passive victims, but active participants, rising in rebellion alongside pirates. And Dragon, instead of being the mysterious leader of a distant army, is at the heart of it all, a visible, decisive force whose choices determine the fate of millions. For Luffy, This war is the culmination of everything. He does not just fight to become Pirate King. He fights to free the seas from the tyranny of the celestial dragons, to defeat Emu, and to reconcile with his father's legacy. His dream of freedom collides with Dragon's dream of reform, and together they forge a new world. Whether Dragon survives or dies, his presence ensures that the final victory is not just about defeating enemies, but about redefining justice itself. In the end, the final war of this timeline is grander, bloodier, and more complex than anything in canon. It is not a simple clash of rebels versus rulers. It is a multifaceted struggle of fathers and sons, of comrades turned enemies, of truth versus lies, of compassion versus tyranny. Dragon's choice to remain in the Marines transforms the war into something both tragic and hopeful, a battle that forces the world to confront not only its rulers, but its own conscience. And when the smoke clears, whatever world emerges will bear the mark of Dragon's influence forever, whether as its reformer, its martyr, or its tragic contradiction. Every story, no matter how vast, eventually comes to an end. In tracing this alternate timeline where Monkey D. Dragon remained in the Marines, we have followed his rise, his influence, and the ripple effects of his decisions across the seas. We have seen how his presence reshaped the Marines, fractured the world government, deprived the world of the Revolutionary Army, and altered the destinies of countless individuals. We have reimagined the great pirate era under his watch. We have placed him at the heart of the world's most iconic events, and we have carried him into the chaos of the final war. Now, at the end of this journey, it is time to step back and ask, what is Dragon's legacy in this timeline? Did he change the world for the better, or did he doom it to greater suffering? The paradox of Dragon's choice defines everything. By remaining in the Marines, he strengthens them as an institution, giving them a moral core and a leader who cares for civilians. Yet by doing so, he prevents the rise of the Revolutionary Army, leaving oppressed people without an organized resistance. The result is a world that is both more humane in some ways and more stagnant in others. Civilians see glimpses of compassion from Marines like Dragon, but they also suffer longer under tyranny because there is no larger force to liberate them. Pirates expand unchecked, becoming both villains and accidental liberators. The Yonko grow stronger, their territories more entrenched, and all the while, Dragon fights from within, pushing for reform but facing constant resistance from above. His legacy is one of tension. He is a man who saves lives, but also a man whose choice cost the world its greatest organized rebellion. Yet even within this paradox, Dragon leaves an indelible mark. His philosophy of justice spreads throughout the Marines, inspiring countless soldiers to question their orders, to protect civilians, to see themselves not as enforcers of tyranny, but as guardians of peace. Even if he never fully overthrows the celestial dragons, he changes the culture of the Marines. The institution is no longer monolithic. It is fractured, unstable, but also more alive than ever. For the first time in centuries, Marines are not simply tools. They are individuals making choices, and many of those choices are shaped by Dragon's influence. That alone ensures that his legacy endures. The irony is that Dragon, in choosing to remain within the Marines, becomes both a reformer and a symbol of rebellion anyway. Civilians whisper his name, not as the world's most wanted man, but as the only Marine who truly cares. Pirates respect him, not for his ruthlessness, but for his compassion. Even kings and rulers see him as different. A Marine who might protect them from tyranny rather than enforce it. In the end, Dragon becomes what he would have been as a revolutionary, a symbol of resistance. The only difference is that his rebellion takes place inside the uniform rather than outside it. His relationship with Luffy also defines his legacy. In canon, Luffy grows up never knowing his father, rebelling against an absent figure who embodies the world's greatest rebellion. In this timeline, Luffy grows up under the shadow of a Marine hero, rebelling against a father who represents order and justice. Their paths collide, not as strangers, but as family, as father and son whose visions for the world cannot be reconciled. Dragon wants reform. Luffy wants freedom. Dragon believes in working within the system, even as he despises its corruption. Luffy believes in rejecting the system entirely, forging a new path with his own hands. Their eventual clash, whether on the battlefield or in ideology, becomes one of the greatest emotional cores of this alternate history. And yet, even in conflict, their bond endures. Dragon may not understand Luffy's dream, but he respects it. Luffy may reject Dragon's uniform, but he inherits his will. The will to fight for others, to protect the weak, to challenge tyranny no matter the cost. In that sense, Dragon's greatest legacy is not the Marines he reshaped or the reforms he fought for. It is the son who carries his spirit forward in a different form. The Final War, in this timeline, as we explored, is the ultimate expression of Dragon's contradictions. He stands as Fleet Admiral or as a reformist leader, commanding soldiers loyal to him against those loyal to Akainu and the Celestial Dragons. The war is bloody, tragic, and monumental. It reveals the truth of the Void Century, exposes Emu, and tears down the illusions of the world government. Dragon's presence ensures that the Marines are not simply the enemy in this war, but also part of the rebellion, split between tyranny and compassion. His choices in this war, whether to protect civilians, whether to shield his son, whether to sacrifice himself, determine the shape of the new world. If he survives, he may become the first truly just Fleet Admiral, leading a marine institution that protects people instead of oppressors. If he dies, he becomes a martyr, his sacrifice inspiring the birth of a new age. Either way, his role ensures that justice itself is redefined. So, what does this alternate history teach us? It shows us the complexity of justice in One Piece. Justice is not absolute. It is not a word carved in stone. It is a living, breathing idea, shaped by the people who wield it. Akainu believes justice is absolute obedience. Okiji believes it is tempered by morality. Fujitora believes it is grounded in humanity. And Dragon, in this timeline, believes it is revolutionary, even within a uniform. His presence forces the world to confront what justice really means, and his absence from the Revolutionary Army forces pirates, civilians, and his own son to take up the burden of freedom themselves. The greatest irony of all is that by staying in the Marines, Dragon may have achieved less than he did in canon, at least in the short term. Without the Revolutionary Army, kingdoms suffer longer, civilians despair, and the Yonko grow stronger. Yet, in another sense, his impact is greater. By fighting from within, he exposes the contradictions of the world government to the world. By clashing with Akainu, he forces the Marines to confront their soul. By standing on the battlefield with his son, he ensures that the final war is not just about defeating enemies, but about deciding what justice will mean in the new era. His legacy is not a simple story of victory or defeat. It is a story of struggle, sacrifice, and contradiction, just like the world itself. For Luffy, Dragon's legacy is both a burden and an inspiration. He carries the weight of being the son of a marine reformer, even as he chooses piracy. His rebellion becomes more personal, more charged, because he is not only defying the world, but his own bloodline. Yet in the end, he proves that freedom cannot be contained by any system, no matter how noble its intentions. Luffy's journey to become Pirate King is shaped by Dragon's shadow, but it is also illuminated by Dragon's spirit. He inherits not his father's uniform, but his will, the will to fight for a world where people can be free. And so, we come to the outro. This journey through an alternate history has shown us how one decision could change everything. Monkey D. Dragon, by staying in the Marines, alters the course of the great pirate era, the fate of kingdoms, the rise of pirates, and the very definition of justice. The Revolutionary Army never rises, but revolution still burns in the hearts of civilians, in the ranks of soldiers,